Thanks for downloading the Marcus Pye podcast.
Welcome to the Marcus Pye podcast on historicracingnews.com. This episode brought to you by LeMansCoupes.com. Visit LeMansCoupes.com to see the range of iconic sports and race cars manufactured to the original designs of the 1960s. Today I find myself in rural Surrey with one of the great enthusiasts of motorsport for the last half century or so, and also one of the most influential people within racing for many a year. I'm with Liz Thacker from Showmex and BP, to give it its complete title. Les, walking around your lovely house here today, I've found a superb photograph of Chris Amon in the Alton Park Gold Cup in the Ferrari, little bit crossed up, absolutely superb, coming into your feet on the apex, and it's clear you're just a total petrol head.
Well, that's quite a good intro, how I got into motorsport, actually, Marcus, in terms of I left the army in 1963 and was looking round for a job to do. Today, of course, youngsters would instantly aim for the IT industry. In those days, the go-go place to go was the oil industry, petroleum industry. So I wrote to a couple of companies, Esso and Showmex and BP as it then was, seeing if I was employable. And fortunately, Showmex and BP said yes. Part of the process was a 6-month training session, and part of that training session was a month at a huge installation, which is now part of the Chelsea Village, of course, where they had the racing side. In those days, of course, a lot of cars ran on dope, so it meant that there had to be a team at all the...
This is not marijuana, by the way. This is dope fuel.
No, yeah, this
which
is...
comprised?
Methanol and alcohol and all the rest of it. So they'd have a team, a specialist team, mostly drivers to take, that's the tanker drivers, to take all the kit to a track and set it up. But part of the process was there was a laboratory, not at the track, but at the installation at Lensbury, which is by Wandsworth Bridge. Now, I had to do a month in this lab, not particularly concerned with racing, but specs for lubricants and petrol and diesel and fuel oil, because everything was quality tested before it left the installation. Tongue-in-cheek, I asked the boss of the labs about, a bit of a young petrol head in those days, about would it be possible to go to one of the meetings. Quite to my surprise, he said to me, there's a big Formula One meeting going on at Snetterton this weekend. Make sure you're in the Castle Hotel at Norwich for breakfast, and somebody there will sort you out with passes. Unbelievable. So, of course, I made sure I was up at Snetterton or Norwich, the Castle Hotel, 8 o'clock on the Sunday morning, walked in, and all round the breakfast table, Innes Island, Graham Hill, Jim Clark, and various other top Formula One drivers having breakfast. They sort of said, sit down and have breakfast with us. Just unbelievable for a 21-year-old. So that's how I started in terms of being connected. I was then into photography in a big way as well. Another stroke of luck. I wrote to the BARC, whose secretary was John Morgan, saying, can I have a press pass? Again, tongue-in-cheek. And lo and behold, a press pass turned up for one of the Goodwood meetings. Took some photographs, sent them off to John. He started using them in various BARC publications. Every time I wrote for a press pass, whether it be a Grand Prix or whatever, all of a sudden I was a photographer who apparently they knew. Absolutely amazing.
Fully fledged about 5 minutes. Overnight sensation.
Could you do that today, Marcus?
I suspect not.
I think not. So that's how I really started in motorsport, purely by luck, purely because I was working for Showmex and BP. And don't forget, Shell, BP, and Esso were the fairy godmothers of motorsport, all things motoring competition in those days. So it was just a very happy coincidence.
But it was great because, I mean, you approached them politely and in the right way. You rang a bell with them, tripped the cord, and the gates opened, and you were in.
That was it. And it got even better than that because my real job with Shellmex and BP, and ultimately BP, was marketing. So I had various nice jobs within BP on the marketing side. But I think it was 1968, BP decided that, and don't forget, they were spending huge amounts of money in those days. They were spending, all the oil companies, tobacco-type money, budgets. And BP were heavily involved in the North Sea then on exploration and all the rest of it. And they were obviously looking at the bottom line and where to cut things. And one of the things they cut was motorsport. That was in 1968. Esso, within weeks, decided this is a great move, so they pulled out. And that left really only Shell and Castrol sort of still operating within motorsport. Well, then in 1974, about 6 or 7 years later, BP suddenly decided that they wanted to get back into motorsport, not on the basis that had been done before, which was very much a corporate exercise, but purely marketing-based with product. So motorsport had to sell product. And lo and behold, my name pops up, and I was asked if I'd like to start up a division for motorsport again. How lucky can you get, Marcus?
Is the Pope a Catholic? Absolutely, you were there.
Yeah. Now, it got even better than that because I was given a free hand. I mean, it was starting off anew. And the first meeting I went to of any significance was a bike meeting, funny enough, in the Isle of Man. And the Isle of Man, as you know, the TT's in June, with the Manx Grand Prix in September. And BP, or Shellmex and BP, still had this team of drivers and equipment and all the rest of it operating out of the base at Townmead Road in Wandsworth. And the Isle of Man TT has to have a whole infrastructure built around it for refueling and all the rest of it. So for 3 or 4 weeks, you know, the whole team used to go over to the Isle of Man to set up all the kit there and you know, associate themselves with all the competitors. So I took this as an exercise to go over and have a look at how motorsport was being done by the competitors. And it suddenly dawned on me that there was probably, 1,000 competitors over there, bikes, tie cars and all the rest of it. And every one of them on the fairings had a decal, or they called in those days stickers. And in fact, they were lost. You could have a Shell or a Castrol or a Dunlop, Ferodo, all these stickers on the bikes. And in fact, you never saw any of them. It was like a wallpaper. And I thought, well, there's not much use joining this exercise because all that's going to happen is you're going to put another sticker on the bike. So big risk. I took the decision for, it would have been 75, the full season in 75, that we wouldn't go ahead do as the other oil companies were doing, having lots and lots of contracts. We'd pick out half a dozen on the car side, half a dozen on the bike side, and make them totally BP. You know, I introduced BP leathers for the riders. They all used to be run around in black leathers, if you remember, in those days.
Absolutely.
On the car side, we equipped our contracted drivers with those chevron...
with the green and yellow chevrons, yeah, absolutely.
So it got to the stage where you had some really top-class competitors in various formulae come in to want to be associated with BP because A, there wasn't a lot of them, you know, they weren't up against a lot of other people, but B, there was some sort of exclusivity in it.
Very much so. And you had kind of a pretty much a free hand, did you, in all this?
I can't believe how lucky I was. I mean, obviously there was checks and all the rest of it on with budgets and how you performed. But nobody sort of said to me, we want you to do this, as long as you were supporting the product, and that was having an end effect on sales, you were doing the right job. It was a big risk, of course, because if you picked the wrong people, there wasn't an awful lot you could tell in advertising, was there? But, it was just very, very lucky. And we had some great guys along the way, people who everybody's heard of now.
But you've been a big fan for a lot of years anyway prior to that, so you had your eye in on the game, and you knew who were the up-and-coming stars and who were the establishment, etc., and so you could pick accordingly. Yeah.
And as I say, there's this business of... it wasn't just the competitors. You could actually pick to a certain degree and get exclusive arrangements with suppliers. So I mean, we had a super arrangement going with Volkswagen Audi, and so we had all the top Formula 3 engines, the original Volkswagen engines that came out. When everybody, I think you'll remember, were you using Toyota in those days? In F3, I think they were.
F3, yeah, the Toyotas were pretty much the thing to have for most of the 70s into the early 80s. Then VW came in.
That's right. Well, we were the first ones to come in with VW. So there was a lot going for it as long as you got it right.
And did that give you OE business as well with those manufacturers?
You've hit it right on the head. I mean, when we got into much, much later on, into bed with Ford when they brought back the turbo F1 engine. The great selling point on that was that it wasn't just factory fill business. It was the recommendations for lubricants. Don't forget, lubricants is the big profit earner. Petroleum product, i.e. either fuel, petrol or DERV. I don't know if it's still called DERV, but diesel. The margins are very small on it, whereas lubricants is a much better earner for oil companies. And
certainly we recall some of the great BP campaigns, and viscostatic comes straight to mind as being something that everyone had. And then there were synthetic oils, weren't there? All sorts of bits and pieces. The whole marketplace moved on dramatically. But much of this with the benefit of being seen, at least by the end user, as being developed through your motorsport program.
Well, I shouldn't probably say this, but BP were probably the worst marketeers of all the oil companies. Shell were definitely top-class marketeers. BP were by far and away the finest exploration company and the finest research company. All the advances in lubrication for the ordinary guy in the street came from BP. First multigrade oil, BP. First long life oil, which they called long life, BP. First very low viscosity oil, VF7. And so with VF7, of course, we tied that in with the Formula 2 European success with Tolman and Derek Warwick and Brian Henton. But the thing about that was that, again, I had a free hand in terms of I didn't have to use Saatchi's. Everybody's heard of Saatchi's, the huge advertising agency. That was the main agency for BP. But all I wanted was a small creative workshop, if you like. So I was allowed to use a little workshop in Covent Garden who were top creative directors from huge agencies like Saatchi's, who'd left to start their own agency and did nothing but creative work. They weren't interested in research or any of the other add-ons which you get with a larger agency. So the first thing I said to them when went to them to see what their ideas was, do not put anything in front of me that says BP wins again, because you'll remember every advert in those days. Dunlop wins again, Shell wins again, Feroda wins again. And sometimes they're all advertising that they won the same event. You know, how many times have you seen the Monte Carlo Rally all been won by different companies? Now, it can only be one winner, but one of them would say they've won the Ladies' Cup. And but to me, that didn't actually say anything because, again, all the oil companies were doing the same thing. we win. So what I said to the agency is, let's have some sort of educational advert in terms of links the product to success, but not saying BP wins. And so they came out with these, fantastic series of adverts. And I'll show you some of those a little bit later on, which leads me on to a lovely story about Sterling, actually, and advertising with this agency. Sterling have been a long-term contracted driver with BP. I mean, he and Fangio were contracted way back in the very early 50s to BP. And he was still with us when I took over. And I went to this agency and said, how about we use Sterling? And in those days, before all the Adobe type software you have today, where nothing is drawn, it's all done digitally on computers, the scans that they put in front of you were always hand-drawn sort of cartoons. And so they went through this series of sort of 5 or 6 ideas about using Sterling. And they came to the last one, and all there was Sterling's bald head from the sort of there up. And I said, God, I said, he's a mate. I can't show him this. And they said, no, it's a great idea. He'll love it. I said, no. They said, well, you go through the rest of the 5 or 6 with him. But, do us a favour, take this one as well. So anyway, pop round to Sterling's, to have coffee and sort of discuss this advertising campaign with him. And I kept this one right to the end, and I'm terribly embarrassed. I said, Sterl, I said, look, I'm very sorry about this. Agency idea, of course, nothing to do with me, blah, blah, blah. I'm not very happy about this. He said, I love it. Fantastic. So, and that was the winning advert. It came up with this fantastic headshot of Sterling from there up. But he's so recognisable, isn't he?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's just how it is.
And again, this sort of linked the product to a personality, but not in this success way. Which
and Sterling loved his number 7. So was it a coincidence that VF7 became that? When
I don't think it did actually. I don't know. God knows how they came up with that idea. I wasn't privy to that, but of course the Tolman car, which we talked about earlier, the winning car was number 7 because we could actually pick the race number in those days. So, and that was totally made out like a VF7 can, really. But
it was. And do you know that's 40 years ago? I was at Goodwood for the launch of that team, as I'm sure you were on the same day. We were all there, and we wrote a great story about it for Autosport magazine. It made the front cover. The car looked $1 million. And, of course, at the start of the season, it was Derek Warwick and Stephen South going to drive the cars. And then Stephen had his accident and other situations sort of unfolded, and Brian Henton was parachuted in and ended up winning that championship.
That's another story altogether, actually. Stephen, I think, was probably, in terms of raw talent, the most talented driver I had ever signed up. He was a very, very quiet character, and you could walk around on the morning of a race, for example, at Snetterton Formula 3, you could walk around the paddock with him in the morning, and you sensed whether he was going to blitz everybody or it was going to be another day. But if he was on it, nobody could get near him. The guy who was running, I can't remember which Brabham it was. I think it was Jeff Brabham. Is Jeff the oldest?
Jeff's the oldest.
It was Jeff Brabham. Very famous Australian team manager called Pee Wee Siddle.
Greg Siddle,
Pee Wee. And Stephen was really on it one Sunday at Snetterton in the Formula 3. And, nobody got within country mile of him in practice. And Pee Wee came up to me and said, Gordon Bennett, Les, we may as well send everybody home, this is ridiculous. But that was it. If he was on it, he was away. And but that was a very sad episode, really, because part of the deal I had with Tolman's when we... and Autosport ought to be congratulated on this, because Autosport found out about it very early on. I think I started talking to Alex Hawkridge in September of '79. And of course, everything was under wraps about they're building their own car and everything.
And you'd been at that point supporting Derek Warwick with the sort of independent march, hadn't you?
That's it. Yes. Awful march.
The 792. Hideous and not very good. Although Mark Sirro did manage to win the championship.
He did, yeah. But I think there was a lot of modifications went on in his particular car. But anyway, part of the deal was I said to Alex, look, we're going to have Stephen South and Derek Warwick. And he said, Stephen South, absolutely no problem. No, I don't want Warwick, not very keen on Warwick. And I said, well, that's the deal. You're going to have Derek Warwick as well. He said, well, he's a crasher. I said, no, he's not a crasher. I said, it's, that's we had a bad season. Anyway, he took Derek and was blown over by Derek, obviously, because Derek did a fantastic job. But the story about Stephen, I can't go into the real story about it, but what actually happened was...
You can buy the book.
So, yeah, buy the book, yeah. And most of it is true, but that was very, very sad because he went to the States, drove for Paul Newman in Can-Am and had that horrendous accident when everything stuck wide open and he went straight on in. It's just so sad. Paul Newman was fantastic. He, after I think Stephen was 3 or 4 months in hospital while they sorted him out, and obviously he lost his leg in that accident. I picked Stephen up at the airport when he flew home with his father, and it was just so sad. It was because he was a very, very, very talented lad.
But it just he was the full package as far as the driving was concerned, but just out of the car, he was just very, very quiet, very meek, and, he wasn't that sort of promotable mould that drivers are brought up to be now, where they have to sort of do everything to be great out of the car too. I mean, the Andy Prios of this world, who was fantastic in the car, but also brilliant out of it. He could talk to somebody in the boardroom. He could talk to the children of the guests, etc., and worked really, really well for him. But Stephen was just kind of meek and kind of diffident, and let his driving do the talking.
Absolutely, and I still look back on those days with Stephen as fantastic, but at the same time very sad, because he, in my book anyway, undoubtedly would have got into Formula One on a proper basis. I mean, he had the odd drive, test drove the Lotus down at Recar, I think it was, but the car didn't fit him, and lots of things that weren't right. But he'd have certainly been well up there in Formula One.
And it was an era, wasn't it, where, of course, we'd already by that stage very sadly lost Tony Bryce in the Graham Hill aircraft accident, Roger Williamson tragically at Zandvoort, and he was another guy who was a sensational driver and ran with some BP on it, didn't he?
Well, yeah, funny enough, just before I took over at BP, I'd met Tom through a connection, and
This is Tom Wheatcroft, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. Got to know Roger and his father, Dodge, who was he was a super character in his own right. But Roger, like Tom Price, and there was about 3 or 4 of them who should have made it into...
Yeah, they're knocking on the door, weren't they?
Yeah.
And the right brakes would have definitely been right there.
But in those days, of course, it was all as it is today, but in a totally different culture. It was all about money, and if you were able to raise money and all the rest of it. And that's why really, in many ways, I stopped supporting foreign drivers, and we went totally British. I think the last foreign driver I had was Nelson, and And he went straight into Formula One with Bernie, wasn't he? With Brabham.
Yeah, he was quite something. Had those 2 Formula 3 roles that he was alternating between in the championship, and did brilliantly well.
Well, Pee Wee rang him, of course, and but Nelson again was extraordinary character, and there are so many memories I got. I remember Nelson came and had dinner with me and my wife one night, and hi-fi was a big thing in those days. It was a real buzzword. Everybody had hi-fi outfits, stacks of stuff, and he suddenly got into hi-fi, and I got some units in the living room at home. And he was more into talking about this hi-fi than he was. I was interested in talking to him about racing exploits, but he was into hi-fi. And just again to see him, his wife, and he had a young son then, Geraldo, I think his name was, to be associated with these people is another sort of highlight. As you're just so extraordinarily lucky to have gone through life in this sort of era, mixing with these sort of people.
Le Mans Coupés are the only manufacturer that can produce both road and FIA HTP spec GT40s with GT40P chassis numbers. All cars are factory built to the original designs, and our race cars are eligible for international competition. We also produce road and race Cobras and Corvette Grand Sports. Find iconic 60s sports and race cars at lemoncoupes.com.
So there's fascinating stuff. I mean, I'm absolutely intrigued by James Hunt, because having had various run-ins with him over the years, good and bad, he was just an extraordinary character.
Well, French Grand Prix, I'm pretty sure it was about 78, something like that. And by then, James was doing the inter-round commentaries with Murray, which was an interesting pairing.
What a dynamic.
Anyway, Murray, we got down to the French Grand Prix at Ricard on the Thursday, and strangely enough, all the teams stayed at Banlon, and I don't think it had anything to do with the Banlon beach being
Bagnols
being totally topless. I think it had something to do with it.
Sure, it did.
But anyway, Murray grabs me on the late Thursday afternoon, and said, "You doing anything? Are you doing anything tonight?" So I said, "Well, not too sure." Actually, Murray said, "Would you do me a favour?" He said, "I got 2 BBC executives," he said, "accountants over," he said, "just looking at what we're doing." And he said, entertaining them to dinner, he said, with James. He said, "Would you come along and tell a few stories?" So I said, "Well, yeah, okay, Murray." So anyway, Murray had sorted out this beautiful restaurant, on the pavement, lovely food and all the rest of it. And I always remember these 2 BBC executives had suits on. We're on the south of France.
It's slightly incongruous.
Yeah, so anyway, and they were both Scotsmen and very dour, and so there was no James. So I'm sitting opposite these 2 executives from the BBC, and Murray's sort of in between them. And so we have the first course, and Murray's getting a bit anxious because there's still no James, and he's making excuses like, "Well, James is probably doing his homework," which I thought rather funny. But anyway, I was beginning to run out of stories. We'd gone through the main course, and we just about get to the Pud, and in the distance I can see James with 2 rather attractive young ladies on each arm walking along the pavement. I thought, Gordon Bennett. Fortunately, the BBC executives had their back to him, and I sort of kicked Murray, and Murray looked back and went white, absolutely. And James walked straight past, didn't recognise any of us, and the BBC executives didn't recognise the back of him. And it was just extraordinary. But that was James. I mean, he was, as I say, if you were trying to use him in promotions, which he did very well. I mean, look at those Texaco adverts, fantastic. But getting him there and getting him right and everything must have been a nightmare.
It wasn't like Sterling, who in so many later years had Susie there running his diary and making sure he was doing everything that he could possibly do, milking the applause of the crowd and working his sponsorship and all the rest of it.
Sterling was an absolute, just fantastic to work with, absolutely fantastic. First of all, he was very honourable, an absolute gentleman. BP never ever had a contract with him in all those years. I used to send him a letter setting out a couple of things, no contract, not one of these sort of 4-inch Formula One things. And he always performed, did everything perfectly. I went into his office one day. I heard so many stories about Sterling, and he looked at it, always called you old boy. Hello, old boy. And he said, hang on a minute, I'm just writing a few checks out. And I said, "Oh, that's all right, Sterling." He said, "I just changed my bank, old boy. I just changed to I think it was the Chartered Bank, and the checkbook was one of those big commercial ones, not like the ones great big sort of 4-inch wide thing." But what amazed me was it was the first image checkbook I'd ever seen. They had this fantastic photograph of him, bleached out, of him in the van wall. They're stretched out the side on view.
Yeah.
Instantly recognisable to Sterling as the van wall. And that was the background to each check. So I said, God, they're fantastic, Sterling. Well, I've never seen a check like that. He said, no. He said, I just had them done. He said, they like the idea as well. So I said, well, God, they look great. I said, I wouldn't mind one of those. He said, oh, would you like one, old boy? I said, yeah, yes, if I could still. He said, what's your favourite number? So I said, well, same as you, 7. He said, yeah, well, I just started this one. Hang on. So he got to 000007 check, wrote on it, and handed it to me. And it said, pay Liz Thacker. And he said, don't cash that in. And it had 1p on it. And I still got that check somewhere. I must get it framed. But that was Stirl. There's another lovely story about Stirl. We were going to open a motor show or something in, I think it was Norwich. Anyway, it was a train from Liverpool Street. And racing drivers are the most unreliable. They are never on time. So I always used to allow a big time envelope with anything that we're doing with Stirl. I mean, even if we were driving to a race meeting somewhere, he'd always leave an hour because he'd never be ready. Anyway, I got a taxi from the office round to Shepherd Street, where Stirl's house was, to pick him up. And Susie comes to the door and says, it's a little bit late at the moment. I said, oh, all right. So I got rid of the taxi driver. And about half an hour later, we were ready to go. I said, I'll get a taxi. And Sterling said, no, we're going on a scooter. And I thought, oh, Gordon Bennett.
Last thing you want.
Yeah. So I said, look, I'm in a pinstripe suit ready to go to this thing, And he said, no, it's all right, boy. It's all right, old boy. We'll take the scooter. Much better. I said, but I got no kit still. He said, that's not a problem. So older viewers will recognise this phrase. He came out, gave me this Flasher's Mac. Now, a Flasher's Mac was what those strange men used to wear in Charing Cross Road and suddenly open it and they...
Different times, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes.
Hopefully.
That was where the term flashing came in. So he gives me this flashing Mac. And I said, I haven't got a helmet still. So he said, oh, I have Susie's, which was a deer stalker helmet, absolutely ridiculous. So I climb on this scooter and we get down the end of Shepherd Street and Stirl says, I think we could be running out of fuel, old boy. Oh, God, Bennett. So he pulls alongside a taxi driver, and everybody knows Sterling, And then I think everybody knew about this scooter as well. And he said to the cabbie, "Morning, cabbie," he said, "do you know where there's a garage open? I can get some two-stroke fuel." And the cabbie driver said, "Oh, yes, Mr. Moss, Mr. Moss." So we fill up with fuel and head off for Liverpool Street station again. And by now, it's touch and go. Get to the end of Regent Street, and he leans round and he says, "Get off." I said, "What?" He said, "Get off." I said, "What?" He said, "Get off the scooter." So I thought, God, so I'm in this Flashers Mac Deerstalker helmet amongst, everybody
looking like a prize goon.
Trying to get to the office. So I get off the scooter and we push it across this zebra crossing with all these people crossing. I thought, what the hell's going on? Get to another zebra crossing, push that across that one, and he says to me, "Right, get on." And of course, I suddenly realised what he'd done was he knew everything so well. We'd missed all the no right turns, no left turns, pushing this damn scooter. Anyway, get to Liverpool Street, just get on the train. I mean, parking the thing was another thing. And the train was one of those old ones. You remember the separate compartments where...
Yep, absolutely.
Go into the our reserve seats and all on our own, just get out of Liverpool Street. And the door opens, a steward there says, "Good morning, Mr. Moss." Now, he didn't know, he'd never met Sterling before. "Morning, Mr. Moss, would you like coffee?" But Sterling was just instantly recognisable. The story of everybody saying, "Who do you think you are, Sterling Moss?" Brings to mind yet another story. We were driving again somewhere to some race meeting, and Sterling was very kind. I used to drive everywhere. I mean, if he trusted you, you drove, And we were driving somewhere, and he had his helmet.
No pressure then.
No, he had his helmet and his overalls on the back seat. And something suddenly came to me about if we were stopped, what a policeman would say. And so I said to Sir, and he was always getting stopped, for various slight speeding offences.
Dogs in baskets, that sort of thing.
And I said to him, you ever get stopped by a police? He said, "Well, funny enough, I got stopped a few weeks ago." He said, and I'm going slightly more than the speed limit. I said, "Oh, right." I said, what did the policeman say?" He said, "Well, very polite." He said, I wound down the window, and the policeman says to me, "Morning, sir. Do you realise you were going a little bit fast?" And so I said, as we all say, don't we? "Oh, was I?" So the copper apparently said to Sterling's repeating this, he said, "What's your name, sir?" So Sterling said, "Well, Moss." "Moss, yes, Moss, right. Your first name?" "Well, Sterling. How do you spell that?" And Sterling wasn't amused, but no, but it just brings back so many memories of of these people you've been with and associated with, and the stories you can tell over the dinner table.
Exactly. Rolling forward a little, you were involved obviously in nurturing a lot of young British talent through kind of in the early 80s through the Formula Fords and Formula Ford 2000s and into Formula 3. It was really a golden era for British racing. A lot of superb talent out there, and you had, I guess, people like Julian Bailey, Johnny Dumfries, those sort of guys coming through, and many others. Memories of that era?
Well, yeah. Johnny is a classic example, actually, that he's a blue blood, as you know. He's now Johnny Butte, but he's the Marquis of Butte. And a lot of these gentlemen have, shall we say, go off the rev limiter pretty quickly. They go from 0 to 10,000 revs, like in terms of the way they can change. They get upset very quickly, some of them do. And Johnny was, I think it was 83, he'd been in, I can't remember, he'd been in a route, I don't know whose route it was, and was very quick but inconsistent.
Yep.
And Dave Pricey, who was running a BP team for us, said this, and I can't do Dave's Cockney accent. You know what Dave's like. This bloke Dumfries, shall we give him a run at Doddington? And I think it was late September, October. So I said, well, all right, well, we don't know who we're going to run next year. Well, let's have a look at him. So Johnny was sensational, but race day it rained like hell, and he was having a dice up front with Tommy Byrne, who was another super talent.
Who was massively quick.
Yeah, never connected with BP, but a super talented lad. And I think Johnny fell off about one lap from the end in the rain. Came in and stripped off his helmet and didn't treat it very nicely, and was in a. And I said to him, "Yeah, Johnny, that's no way." He said, "Well, I totally mucked up there. There's a chance I had, blah blah blah," and he was really upset with himself. So I said, "Well, let's wait and see." So anyway, we gave him a right next year, and you know what happened. I mean, he just walked everything, and he would have won the European Championship as well, but there was a few. How should I put this politely? Machinations that went on with an Italian team, where there was some talk about discrepancies, but so he just lost out on the European Championship as well.
I knew Johnny when he was a painter and decorator.
Decorator in Fulham.
In Fulham. Absolutely brilliant. Probably my only claim to fame in Formula Ford was getting taken off by Johnny Dumfries on the first lap of a race at Alton Park, and standing there in the paddock afterwards remonstrating with him. And the guy who owned my car, Mark Peters from Slush Puppy, comes up and sees the two of us having a bit of a get-together, and he says, "Have a crisp, boys." We just fell about, and I think that he went on to race in Formula One. He went on to win Le Mans, etc. Is just brilliant.
Well, Johnny's cousin, of course, was another really good driver who I was great friends with, and Charlie Crichton Stewart. And of course, it's Charlie's black book of contacts and addresses. I think he had to lock it up in a safe every night. I think it was, as you say, priceless. But Charlie was the same. He could go off the rev limiter instantly, and we were down at sounds awful, this Monaco Grand Prix, and we were staying in the, I don't know what it's called now, but it's the only hotel in Monte Carlo with its own beach. It was called the Beach Plaza in those days. I don't know what it's called now, but it's right at the far end of Monaco on the Italian side. And anyway, Charlie and I were going to have a meeting about something the following morning for over breakfast. Well, Charlie's always late, and so the time Charlie, and it must have been the Saturday when there's no racing on Grand Prix weekend. I think I'm right. On Saturday they organise the timetable all differently for Monaco. Anyway, there's no Charlie. 5 to 11. I'm still waiting for him in the breakfast buffet area. Nothing. 10 past 11. Charlie turns up, and I said, "Well, I thought we were going to have breakfast, Charlie." He said, "Yeah, it's not a problem." He said, and called across, and it reminded me of the waiter in 40 Towers.
Oh,
Manuel. So this poor little monegasque waiter comes across, and Charlie said, "Good morning, we'll have breakfast." And the waiter, it was straight out of Monty Python, said, "He's a finished." So Charlie said, No, you don't seem to understand. We'd like breakfast, please, so we'll have breakfast. Yeah, he's a finished. Breakfast, he finished. 11 o'clock, he finished. Charlie said, "I don't think you quite understand. We are residents here. Will you get us breakfast?" So he said something again. Well, Charlie had spent his youth, because his father, Lord Patrick Crichton Stewart, had a villa at Cap d'Aille, which is the next little place along from Monaco. So Charlie had spent a lot of his youth in France, so spoke perfect French. So started calling this poor little monegasque waiter everything under the sun, and there are a few choice words in French which are very insulting. So this poor bloke was there, and he still wasn't doing it. So Charlie said, "Get me the manager." So of course the manager had been to Trust House Fortis Charm School and everything, So he comes along.
Service with the grimace.
That's it. Comes along to us, and Charlie sort of said, "Look," and the manager said, "Mr. Crichton Stewart, it's absolutely no problem. Of course you can have breakfast." And the instant thing was, Charlie went from this purple foaming
to puce
to so very kind of you. Thank you very much indeed. But there again, Charlie was a damn good racer. He was Formula 3 with Charlie Lucas, Piers Courage. In fact, they all shared that famous flat in Harrow Road. Bubbles Horsley and Frank Williams. And you can't tell the stories on camera, but some of the stories about Dave Brodie, and who was another one of the set there, and the things they used to get Frank to do, because Frank was always short of a few bob. But some of the things they used to get Frank to do was something again. But,
it's amazing, and I mean, I just love the way you can recall these stories. I mean, I've been involved in racing for 40 odd years, and there's just thousands of them. Everything just trips another memory, doesn't it? And
the problem is, Marcus, you're a craftsman with words, and people say to you, "Why don't you write a book?" And the problem is you can't write a book because you can't tell the real stories.
Yeah.
And it's useless writing a book which how many motor racing books is written by a driver or ghosted by a driver, and it says on the fourth lap at Alton Park I did a 1:32. They're boring as hell. The best book, one of the best reads ever, is AJ's book, Alan Jones's book. And there's another friend of mine.
Tells it as it is, I should think.
There's another friend of mine who sadly died a couple of years ago, and you probably bumped into him. I call him an American, Keith Botsford, who was the Sunday Times correspondent for 20 years. But what people don't realise about Keith was he was the most incredibly cultured, cosmopolitan character. His mother was an Italian countess, so he'd been brought up in Italy and in England. He was a professor emeritus of one of the East Coast universities in the States. I think it was Boston University. He'd worked in intelligence with the army, so I don't have to go into that anymore, and the connections with the States. And he was just a fantastic guy to have dinner with. And we were in Budapest, and we take me out to dinner, and we were talking over dinner. And it was the most incredible history lesson. He was telling me all about Budapest. There's two cities, one side of the Danube, and all the rest of it. But he ghosted Alan's book, and it was just about to be published. So we got talking about the book, and he said, "Oh God," he said, "that was a nightmare." I said, "Really?" Because I knew Alan very well, and I knew a lot of Alan's stories. And I said, "Why was that?" He said, "It took 6 drafts before we could get it through the lawyers." But it is an amazingly good read, because it is, as you say, tell it as it is. I had great fun times with Alan as well.
He was the perfect guy for the Williams FW07, really, wasn't he? I mean, sort of bull-necked, and he could put up with any amount of downforce, and massively determined. You wouldn't have thought perhaps on his way up he was necessarily going to make it, but he was there in the right car at the right time.
You probably knew him in Formula Atlantic.
I remember him in Formula 3, a little bit of Formula Atlantic, yeah.
But he, the only person he ever feared, who I knew very well, because she got on very well with my French wife, was Beverly, his wife. And I think that's the only person he ever feared, because she kept him in order, you know, I mean, no doubt about it. But you know the famous story about Alan, AJ, he did the sort of James Hunt part for Channel 9 in Australia after he'd retired from racing. And I remember this particular incident because the week after, or 2 weeks after, I think it was the Mexico Grand Prix, but it concerned Gerhard Berger, who was driving for Ferrari. And he went on in at, I think it was the same sad corner which Ayrton had his accident in. Anyway, there was a small fire on the Ferrari, and the Australian Murray Walker turned to Alan and said, "Oh, wow, look at that, Alan. That looks a bit dodgy." And AJ said, "Wow, looks like a well-done burger to me." Apparently the switchboard melted, you know. But,
there were some real characters. I think back in those days, 70s and 80s, it was Formula One was replete with characters. They could say what they liked. They did say what they liked, and they were very popular for it. And these days, it's all a bit kind of monotone, isn't it?
Well, I think the sad thing is that, I mean, if he could be let off the leash, I'd love to really listen to Vettel. But there's always a PR person behind with a tape recorder, isn't it? I mean, they can't really say what they want, I'm sure.
That's right. There was some amazing contrast back then, in the days when you had sort of battles between Nigel Mansell and the rest of them, really, because Nigel was just incredible on his day, but you compared him with Nelson Piquet, whatever, as characters. They were just polar opposites, weren't they? And they appealed to different sections of the public.
Yeah.
And those are the days when Autosport was selling 100,000 a week, and a good week when our Nigel was winning.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Again, the internet has done so much damage.
Well, it's sad in a way, isn't it? I'm
a bit of a traditionalist. I like a magazine that I can read anywhere, a hard copy.
Yeah.
Long may it continue.
Yeah, it's no. I again, it's the culture you're brought up in, isn't it? You know, I mean, for the youth of the day, they are so used to everything being computerized that. Probably doesn't make any difference to them at all. Yeah,
it's like these days, you've got your 8-year-old Carter goes out for a test session at Rye House, whatever it is, comes back in, and the first thing to look at is a computer trace of what he's done. I mean, it kind of wasn't really happening in a lot of the years that you were involved at the coalface, the front line.
No, it's. I mean, the engineers haven't really changed in terms of. The data they're taking. It's just the way it's presented now.
That's right. And I think, you had drivers who would instinctively, back in the 70s and 80s, they'd come around and they'd actually know within a tenth what they were going to see on their lap boards. It wouldn't ping up on the dash, but they know they'd done an 18.2 at Brands Hatch or whatever it was, not an 18.3 or 4. And it's just very different, and it's different. It's why drivers from different eras wouldn't really have thrived in any other era. It's easy to say, who was the best or who wasn't the best, but Fangio wouldn't have worked particularly well in another era. Michael Schumacher wouldn't have worked 15, 20 years before he was in his full pomp. And you can only be compared with those who you're directly competing against at the time, can't you?
But there are people. I mean, Ayrton Senna was you were privileged to watch Ayrton, and he was almost computerized. The Australian Grand Prix in Adelaide, it must have been about 86, because I was looking after Johnny then, Johnny Dumfries, and Johnny was his partner in the Lotus Grand Prix car. And I'd gone out to one of the corners on one of the practice sessions to have a look at, the car and what it was doing and everything. And in those days on the long haul Grand Prix, There was no facilities. I mean, everybody operated out of sort of refrigerated 45-foot containers. There was no huge hospitality things they have today. And anyway, we came in after the practice, and I was at one end of the container with Johnny talking about something, and Ayrton was at the far end of the container fiddling about with his helmet, putting a visor on or something, ready to go out again. And I was talking to Johnny about a particular corner and what the Lotus was doing, and I could see Ayrton sort of like this, and he came across, he said, "What was that you were saying, Les, about that corner? What was the car doing?" And I thought, the guy never switches off.
So I remember him in Formula Ford really well in '81, and he went to Thruxton, where a Formula Ford car on treaded tyres is bucking and writhing all round the back of the circuit, and he put in several laps that were within a hundredth or two of each other, not just a tenth or a half a second, as some of the others might have aspired to, and he was just extraordinary. And that ability to go flat out of the blocks while everyone else is saying, "Oh, the tyre's quite warm enough, can I lean on them into this corner?" Didn't really didn't occur to him. It was just one of those things that his ability transcended.
Well, in those, you witnessed them as I did, those days of the grenade turbo, especially for the last 5 laps of a qualifying session. It didn't matter where you were. Ayrton would go out right at the end, and every team manager went out to have a look. They all went out on the out of the pits to watch him. It was just phenomenal. I remember, funny enough, one more story about drivers who are like computers. I remember chatting with Ken Tyrrell once, so we were talking about Jackie, and I said to Ken, what makes Jackie so good, so much ahead of everybody else? And he said, we sit down, and he said, if we reckon that it's going to be a 1:34.6 to do a lap to win the race, he said Jackie can go out there, and he said he'll do a 1:34.6, 1:34.5, and he said he's so consistent. We decide how quick he's going to go, and he said he can just, and again, it's just this sort of talent, which is not just driving quick, but is being able to...
It's that superhuman
put
ability,
everything in it, yeah.
And everything gets paced, doesn't it? Yeah. But I think when you talk about Ayrton going incredibly quickly into practice, I always remember standing at Brands Hatch on Paddock Hill Bend on the Marshalls Post watching Keke Rosberg come out for his final qualifying lap in that Williams Honda, which was a bit of a shed, really, but it had loads and loads and loads of power. And I remember him coming out of the pits, coming through to start the flying lap, and taking about 3 steps back behind this simple little breeze block Marshall's hut, which wouldn't have protected us for anything. It didn't come off it. And then the next lap he came through pulling, 190 miles an hour or something up to Paddock Hill Bend, and you thought to yourself, he's earned his money. He did the same thing at Silverstone, that incredible lap he did at Silverstone. But you saw all the best of them, and you saw some who, I guess, disappointed you by not perhaps making it to the top ranks, guys that you'd nurtured and helped along the way. 1 or 2 didn't quite get there, or found their métier in a different motorsport arena, perhaps not in Formula One, but in sports cars.
Yeah, I suppose one of the disappointments was, and again it involves Ayrton, because might have put Ayrton in the car, but by then, at the end of '82, I think I decided that we'd only, we had to really keep concentrating on British drivers. Was that we put Calvin Fish in the car in '83, the year before Johnny, and he didn't perform as I thought he was going to. He he'd win a few races, then it just wasn't consistent. But he went off to America, and I think he did okay in some of the formula over there.
And became a commentator over there. Which,
Oh, did he?
Did very, very well at it. But
Right.
the other guy who always strikes me as being someone who perhaps got away was John Pratt, who's now very instrumental in running the simulators for these young drivers. And on his day, he was phenomenal, wasn't he?
I think John was just a bit too tall.
He was, yeah, absolutely.
But no,
he was from down Bournemouth way, and I remember Adrian Reynard saying something about him, which was funny. Adrian, who'd built cars that he'd raced in Formula Ford, etc. He said the problem with John was that he was the most consistently inconsistent driver I ever worked with.
yeah,
Which, of course, is the thing he's knocking out of all these clients who come along to learn the trade today. A very, very different era.
yeah. I think that's not a bad analysis by Adrian, actually. He was. I think when he came out with that revolutionary Formula Ford car, the very pointed one, that's the first year I had an involvement with Adrian, although his father worked for BP. I knew his father very well.
Really?
His father was one of the top automobile engineers we employed at BP on the development side, and he looked very, very proud of his son.
And still club racing and historic racing and things today, Adrian. Yeah,
is he?
Absolutely loving every second of it.
Yeah, it's my not terribly. Adrian tried to teach me to water ski, and I wasn't too good at that, mind you. I think him and Rick were
Tricky Ricky Gorn. Could sell fridges to Eskimos.
He was amazing, absolutely. Probably only bettered by Robin Herd.
Another story. But you had a wonderful career, which you didn't kind of really leave formally, did you? Just kind of you sort of backstepped a little bit away, but still called up as on consultancy basis.
Yeah, well, I left BP in '85. Everybody thought I'd had a brain hemorrhage. Because you don't leave the position I had with 2 children and a mortgage. But I decided I wanted to do my own thing, nothing to do with motorsport, but a purely advertising and marketing agency. And within 6 months, I'm back as a consultant for BP. The interesting thing is that as a consultant, people listen to you, whereas if you're just a senior manager, they don't listen to you all the time. But, and the pay is somewhat better as well.
Always helps, doesn't it?
Yes.
It sweetens the pain.
Yes, yeah. But so I never really left BP until about 2000, sometime in the early 2001. And by then I'd been with them, taken them into Formula One with Ford. LaRousse. That was another interesting experience with LaRousse, very French team. And BP France asked me if I'd sort that out for them. And my goodness me, the LaRousse team taught me how to do or how to experience hospitality. They had it down to a T. Didn't matter where in the world you were, the very finest restaurant they used to entertain their VIPs.
As one would expect.
Yeah. But
inversely proportional to results.
Yeah. And they had some interesting drivers, but very French, and they should have done an awful lot better than they did. But
there's always extenuating circumstances in these cases, aren't there? But I mean, over 40 odd years, you saw the best and the worst of motorsport at all levels, and a fantastic position to have had a career of that magnitude. I think it's amazing, remarkable.
Well, I suppose in a way it's like being a professional golfer, isn't it? You know, where can you do something and get paid, do something you love and get paid for it as well?
As they say, it beats working. Liz Thacker, thank you very much indeed.